Rick Ross did not lose public attention in one disastrous night. Rick Ross lost something more expensive, the benefit of the doubt. The change began quietly, inside comment sections, reaction clips, airport footage, podcast jokes, and every fresh argument about money. A larger question now shadows every new Rick Ross post. Has the empire changed? Or has the audience finally changed the way Rick Ross looks? For years, Rick Ross sold scale better than almost anyone in rap. Rick Ross made success sound heavy. A Rick Ross record could turn a car into a statement, a bottle into a trophy, and a regular room into a board meeting. The voice carried certainty. The imagery carried abundance. The brand carried one message. Rick Ross was already inside a life most people could only imagine. That image did not emerge from nowhere. William Leonard Roberts, too, grew up around Carroll City, Florida, after an early childhood connection to Clarksdale, Mississippi. Miami offered harsh contrasts. Struggle close to display windows, ambition near instability, luxury sitting beside scarcity. A young William Leonard Roberts, too, saw how presentation could become protection and how aspiration could become identity. Music offered a route out and a language for scale. Before the Maybachs, before the sprawling Georgia property, before the champagne rituals and the boss slogans, Rick Ross was a rapper building a character large enough to fill a room. Early work under Teflon Don and Carroll City Cartel created a foundation. The Rick Ross name expanded the frame. Then Hustlin' arrived in 2006 with a blunt chant, a thunderous delivery, and an instantly recognizable world. Port of Miami followed with a #1 debut, a career move from possibility to proof. From that point, Rick Ross understood a valuable rule. Hits create attention. Repetition creates mythology. Album after album reinforced the same visual language. Marble floors, imported cars, private flights, expensive liquor, waterfront air, loyalty, danger, and control. Teflon Don, God Forgives, I Don't, Mastermind, and later releases made Rick Ross feel less like a performer and more like a permanent setting. Maybach Music Group widened the reach through artists including Meek Mill, Whale, French Montana, and Amarian. Business strengthened the story. Restaurant franchises, beverage partnerships, books, real estate, appearances, and reported investments helped Rick Ross present more than rap star wealth. Rick Ross presented a system. The famous Georgia State, tractor footage, luxury watches, and repeated talk about ventures all delivered one visual. A man who had reached the top, stayed there, and could show the receipts from every angle. But scale creates a trap. The bigger the image, the smaller the margin for contradiction. A rapper can fly commercial without scandal. A rapper can cut grass without scandal. A rapper can make a bad purchase, defend a friend, laugh at a rival, or have a slow ticket week without scandal. Rick Ross turned every ordinary detail into a test because Rick Ross spent years teaching the public to treat every detail as proof of boss status. The unique angle here is not a bankruptcy story, a fake jury story, or a feud story. The deeper story is the price of the symbol. Rick Ross became a living luxury symbol. Symbols do not receive normal human grace. Symbols get audited. Every airport line becomes a verdict. Every watch close-up becomes a forensic exhibit. Every rival's joke becomes a search term. Every explanation becomes part of the evidence file. The first major lesson arrived years ago through the corrections officer controversy. Public records and later remarks brought a past job into conflict with the mythology surrounding Rick Ross. A corrections officer job is not shameful. Work is work. The problem came from the collision between public persona and public discovery. Early denials, later acknowledgments, and repeated rival attacks gave the story a longer life than a simple admission might have created. The nickname Officer Ricky became a shortcut for critics who wanted to question the entire brand. A second pressure point involved the stage name. Rick Ross drew inspiration from Freeway Rick Ross, and a legal fight over the name ended in the rapper's favor under artistic expression protections. A courtroom win settled a legal question. A courtroom win could not force every listener to abandon a perception question. That distinction matters. Law can close a case. Culture keeps a separate file open. Then came the 2024 rupture with Drake. Rick Ross and Drake once looked like durable collaborators. Records such as Stay Schemin' made the connection feel natural, polished, expensive Miami-coded, and commercially powerful. The wider conflict involving Drake, Future, Metro Boomin, and other artists changed the map. Rick Ross chose a side. Drake mentioned Rick Ross. Rick Ross answered with champagne moments. A former alliance became material for public combat. A diss record alone does not damage a legacy. Hip-hop understands conflict. Hip-hop rewards skill, nerve, timing, and memorable lines. The perception problem emerged after the first strike. Critics began asking why Drake remained a frequent target in interviews, clips, social posts, and commentary long after the loudest battle period passed. The question was not whether Rick Ross had a right to answer. The question was whether answering again and again made Rick Ross look powerful or preoccupied. That is where the luxury image met a brutal algorithm. An algorithm does not preserve context. An algorithm preserves the sharpest fragment. A 10-minute business conversation becomes one reaction clip. A complicated dispute becomes one insult. A promotional post becomes a quote tweet battlefield. A wealthy artist can spend years building a mansion perception and lose a room of that mansion every time a 12-second clip suggests irritation. The commercial flight moment shows the mechanism perfectly. Reports and viral posts place Rick Ross at an airport. Rick Ross later said a private jet was receiving a Starlink upgrade and that Rick Ross chose commercial travel for a trip to Colombia. On a normal day, no story exists. Plenty of wealthy people fly commercial. But Rick Ross did not enter the airport as a regular traveler. Rick Ross entered as a symbol whose audience had been trained to expect the private jet frame. The joke appeared before the explanation finished. The same thing happened around jewelry discourse. Online commentators questioned watches and stones visible in clips. Those claims are not self-proving, and viral commentary is not a jeweler's appraisal. Yet the allegation spread because the allegation fit an existing narrative. Once a crowd suspects a gap between image and reality, every shiny object becomes a test. Facts matter. Evidence matters. But attention often moves faster than verification. Tour chatter added another layer. Posts about promotions and reported slower sales circulated online, then became ammunition for rival fandoms. Concert economics are complicated. Local marketing, venue sizes, date changes, inventory strategy, and touring costs can distort any snapshot. Still, Rick Ross had a special vulnerability. The entire presentation depended on effortless abundance. A buy one, get one promotion can be a standard tactic for one performer and a humiliating meme for a performer associated with endless demand. None of those moments erased the catalog. Rick Ross remains connected to classic mixtape energy, blockbuster hooks, major collaborations, and one of rap's most identifiable voices. Rick Ross built a real label platform. Rick Ross moved business conversations into rap conversations. Rick Ross created music that made ambition feel cinematic. Critics can question presentation without pretending achievement never happened. Yet legacy is not a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet can list albums, sales, awards, properties, partnerships, and placements. Legacy lives in emotional shorthand. What does a name make an audience feel before a song starts? For a long time, Rick Ross meant grandeur. More recently, part of the internet hears Rick Ross and anticipates a joke, a rebuttal, a feud update, or a comment section audit. That emotional shortcut is the real crisis. Consider the difference between wealth and authority. Wealth can be shown. Authority gets granted by other people. Rick Ross can display a car, a watch, a house, a jet, or a business deal. The public decides whether each display feels aspirational, defensive, or performative. No amount of luxury can command authority from an audience that senses an argument behind the display. The more urgently a brand insists on status, the more viewers begin asking why the insistence feels necessary. Rick Ross also faces a generational shift. Earlier rap eras often allowed mystique to live undisturbed. Fans heard the record, saw the magazine cover, and accepted the mythology. Modern audiences freeze frames, compare dates, search property records, parse comments, remix interviews, and build alternate narratives in hours. Every celebrity now works under crowdsourced surveillance. Rick Ross built an image for a world that admired the illusion. Rick Ross now performs inside a world that monetizes the inspection. The answer is not to abandon luxury rap. Luxury rap remains Rick Ross territory. The answer is to update the contract with the audience. A stronger Rick Ross era would not spend every week proving wealth to strangers. A stronger Rick Ross era would make the music the business and the self-awareness carry the proof. Humor could neutralize old punches. Specific ownership could replace vague flexing. Selective silence could create more gravity than another response video. Imagine the next record opening with Rick Ross addressing the contradiction before every critic can. Not defensive, not wounded, just precise. A line about mowing hundreds of acres because ownership means maintenance. A line about airports because travel is work, not theater. A line about old accusations because a past job paid bills before fame paid bills. A line about rivals because success no longer needs a weekly opponent. That version of Rick Ross could turn the audit into an anthem. The public does not require perfection. The public requires coherence. Rick Ross can be complicated. Rick Ross can have a past. Rick Ross can take commercial flights. Rick Ross can own expensive things. Rick Ross can argue, joke, miscalculate, rebuild, and mature. The audience only needs a story to feel honest enough that every new clip does not look like a contradiction waiting for a caption. There's a hard truth inside every empire narrative. A brand becomes a prison when the brand leaves no room for normal life. Rick Ross created a towering character because towering characters sell records. But towering characters cannot stand in an airport unnoticed. Towering characters cannot explain a watch without creating another debate. Towering characters cannot trade insults forever without looking smaller than the stage. Rick Ross is not finished. The culture has watched too many premature obituaries turn into comeback records. The question is more interesting than decline. Can Rick Ross make the audience feel scale again without demanding that the audience accept every symbol at face value? Can Rick Ross turn scrutiny into material? Can Rick Ross replace reaction with direction? The next chapter will not be decided by a comment section, a jeweler clip, a rival post, an airport video, or one ticket promotion screenshot. The next chapter will be decided by choices that create a new emotional shortcut. Rick Ross needs listeners to hear a name and think music first, command second, noise last. Rick Ross has already built the castle. The challenge is opening the gates without looking afraid of the crowd outside. The biggest irony is simple. Rick Ross spent a career making luxury sound untouchable. Now the most valuable flex may be touchability. A clear truth, a well-timed joke, a colder silence, a stronger song, a better reason to look forward. Rick Ross does not need a bigger symbol. Rick Ross needs a story that survives the symbol. So every fan, critic, and casual observer faces the same question. Is Rick Ross watching an empire fall apart? Or is Rick Ross standing at the exact point where a myth can become more human, more durable, and more dangerous? The answer depends on one decision. Keep defending the picture, or create a picture no old joke can control. Rick Ross has survived doubt before. Rick Ross has survived industry changes, label politics, public ridicule, shifting tastes, and competitors with louder headlines. Survival alone, however, is not the goal. Reinvention is the goal. The strongest move from Rick Ross now is not another receipt. The strongest move is a record, an interview, and a public posture, so complete that the old frame loses power. Rick Ross can still make wealth sound like atmosphere. Rick Ross can still make ambition sound like cinema. Rick Ross can still turn a room into a kingdom. But the next kingdom needs windows. The audience has already arrived outside. A closer look at the feud reveals another strategic problem. Attention is not ownership. A rival can mention Rick Ross once and borrow a week of headlines. Rick Ross can answer 10 times and accidentally donate 10 more weeks. Every answer may feel satisfying in the moment. Every answer may also teach the audience that a rival still owns a remote control. The most expensive currency in celebrity is not cash. The most expensive currency is direction. Whoever decides the subject of conversation controls the room. Rick Ross once controlled the room through atmosphere. A Rick Ross feature could make another artist sound richer before the second verse arrived. A Rick Ross ad-lib could make a song feel larger. A Rick Ross album intro could make listeners picture a gate opening somewhere above ordinary life. That old power came from world building, not debate. The strongest comeback strategy starts with a return to world building. The next Rick Ross visual does not need a price tag in every frame. The next Rick Ross visual needs texture. Sunrise over the state. A studio desk covered in notebooks. A franchise manager opening a store. A quiet drive after a long flight. A meeting with young artists. A close-up of work rather than a wide shot of proof. Luxury becomes more believable when luxury sits beside labor. Grandeur becomes stronger when grandeur no longer begs for applause. Even the tractor became a symbol because the public saw two different stories. Supporters saw ownership, discipline, acreage, and a man enjoying property built through decades of work. Critics saw a chance to mock a wealthy rapper doing a job associated with saving money. Both readings say more about audience expectations than mowing grass. Rick Ross could own that split with one honest observation. Maintenance is part of ownership. A kingdom needs upkeep. The airport clip created the same double reading. Supporters saw practical travel. Critics saw a crack in the private jet mythology. The missing ingredient was not an explanation about technology. The missing ingredient was narrative control. Rick Ross could have made the commercial flight look intentional before the internet made the flight look defensive. A simple post about a working trip, a playlist, a conversation with a fan, or a joke about a gate number would have changed the emotional temperature. That is the hidden villain in the Rick Ross story. Not Drake, not 50 Cent, not a jeweler, not an airport camera, not a viral account. The hidden villain is a gap between a carefully built symbol and an internet that profits from testing symbols. The internet does not need to prove an accusation to make an accusation travel. The internet only needs a clip that fits a familiar joke. For Rick Ross, every old controversy became useful material for outsiders because every controversy connected to one central question: authenticity. The corrections officer story became bigger than a job. The name lawsuit became bigger than a legal case. The UNO backlash became bigger than a lyric. The jewelry questions became bigger than jewelry. Each episode entered the same public folder marked: is the image real? That folder now opens whenever a new clip arrives. A mature response does not argue with every file in the folder. A mature response changes the folder's title. Rick Ross can make the next era about construction, building companies, building records, building opportunities, building a safer relationship with truth. The audience loves transformation when transformation feels voluntary. The audience punishes transformation when transformation arrives only after exposure. Rick Ross has an opportunity to choose the first path. Music remains the clearest route. No interview can compete with a record that gives fans a new sentence to repeat. No social post can compete with a song that makes the rivalry irrelevant. Rick Ross has built entire songs around images that listeners could see immediately. The next great image could be less obvious and more powerful. Rick Ross in a quiet room, counting lessons instead of objects. Rick Ross making wealth sound earned, not merely displayed. There's also a business lesson. Brands fail when brands confuse visibility with trust. Visibility can be purchased through posts, features, press runs, and conflict. Trust comes from consistency over time. Rick Ross has enough visibility. Rick Ross needs more moments that make the audience stop looking for catch. A documented business win, a candid conversation about mistakes, or a focused creative project could provide more long-term value than another luxury close-up. Fans should also resist the temptation to turn every rumor into a verdict. Claims about watches, finances, ticketing, or travel deserve evidence. Public figures deserve criticism, but public figures also deserve standards. A viral clip cannot replace records, contracts, appraisals, or verified reporting. At the same time, Rick Ross cannot expect the public to ignore patterns created by years of image-heavy messaging. Responsibility exists on both sides of the screen. The future depends on discipline. Discipline means no automatic response. Discipline means no rage post disguised as confidence. Discipline means no explanation longer than the question requires. Discipline means choosing battles where art can win. Discipline means understanding that a comeback is not a speech about respect. A comeback is a sequence of actions that makes respect feel obvious again. Rick Ross has another advantage: familiarity. Even critics know the voice, the laugh, the ad-libs, the estate, the slogans in the musical world. Familiarity can become a cage, but familiarity can also become a launch pad. One sharp reinvention can transform old memes into background noise. The key is surprise, not a louder luxury claim, not a bigger argument, a surprise and perspective. Picture a campaign built around the phrase maintenance of a masterpiece. Rick Ross shows estate, but Rick Ross also shows repairs. Rick Ross shows a jet, but Rick Ross also shows planning. Rick Ross shows a studio, but Rick Ross also shows revisions. Rick Ross shows success, but Rick Ross also shows the cost of sustaining success. The campaign would not shrink the myth. The campaign would give the myth a foundation. That approach turns an apparent weakness into a signature strength. Critics say Rick Ross performs wealth. Rick Ross answers by performing stewardship. Critics say Rick Ross talks about a lifestyle. Rick Ross shows the work behind the lifestyle. Critics say every image needs defense. The story remains open. The next move matters. The music decides.